This is Sonnie from New Zealand Wealth and Risk and Fathom Wealth. The purpose of this video is to illustrate one of the exercises that I go through with a lot of my clients. I call it flawcasting, and the reason I call it flawcasting, it's very deliberate, is because it will be wrong. That doesn't stop it from being a really valuable exercise, and it certainly gives you perspective and gives you a way of looking at some of the financial trade-offs that you make, whether that's investing a little bit more or less aggressively, saving more or less, retiring earlier or later, upsizing or downsizing or right-sizing your home and at certain ages. It also gives you an insight into certain assumptions that you're going to have to make. For example, how much your retirement expenditure might be, what you might receive for New Zealand Super, and at what age. And the important thing is that it's a flawcast. It's based on a number of assumptions, and long-term outcomes are extremely sensitive to these assumptions. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know how long you're going to live. We don't know what your health situation is going to be. We don't know what the twists and turns of your career will be. We don't know what social, technological, economic, environmental, political sort of factors are going to occur over the next several decades, if you're that young preparing for retirement, or even over the course of decades of your retirement. We can't even predict what your investment return specifically will be. But that doesn't stop us from going through this exercise, which is extremely valuable, and I find that clients often get as much or more out of this process than they do from the specific investment advice that I provide. Hope it's useful. Provide feedback. I have made it a little bit faster just to make it a little bit more engaging, because I won't apologise for it, but I am aware that it is a 15-minute or so video, which is just an Excel spreadsheet. So excuse the chipmunk-like voice.
One of the things that I often do with my clients is I try to flawcast their financial future. Now, I'm very deliberate when I use the term flawcast because the only guarantee I can give is that it will be wrong. Any forecast of the future is going to be littered with assumptions, and none of them will hold up exactly. However, it is still a useful exercise because, well, A, it makes it quite clear what some of the assumptions that you're making might be. It also provides some context for your current situation if we extrapolate trends into the future, and some perspective in some of the more important financial decisions that you might be making over time. So, I mean, here's an example, and every flawcast I do is tailored to a client based on what their unique circumstances and concerns are. But, I mean, this is probably not a bad illustration or example of how these work. So, what we've got here is we've got a chart, and that's probably the easiest thing to look at. What this chart represents, and for this particular client or couple, I'm assuming both people in a couple are age 40, and that we're extrapolating until the age of 100 when they're centenarians. What this line represents is it's the opening balance, or the value of their investment portfolio at that date. Now, this is separate from any equity they might have in their home. In this particular flawcast, I'm assuming that this 40-year-old couple have their own home, but they do have a mortgage against that property. I'm treating home as a separate asset because it provides a roof over your head, so it's worth considering separately. Whereas the investment portfolio component is really there to provide income or capital to provide for your lifestyle when you're no longer generating enough income to support yourself. And so what we're doing here is we're kind of flawcasting or extrapolating what their financial trajectory might be based on a number of fairly straightforward assumptions which we can play around with. So what the story basically tells us here is that between the ages of 40 and 65, they're accumulating assets in two kind of different sets of periods. This first period represents where they're accumulating a fairly small amount each year, and I'm kind of assuming just their KiwiSaver contributions. The reason for that is that over this period, their main focus is just repaying their mortgage. This acceleration of their savings period, that is after they've paid the mortgage and they've now got a lot more income that they're able to put away towards investments and to building up a nest egg to support their lifestyle and retirement. This first little blip here is, I'm assuming, as I'll go into here, that they, from the ages of 65 to 67, they won't receive any New Zealand superannuation or anything of the like. So during this period, they're having to dip into their income, and particularly their capital, at a much steeper rate than from age 67 onwards. Now, at the moment, New Zealand super people are eligible at the age of 65. I've built into this Flawcast the assumption that they won't receive it until the age of 67, but again, it's something that we can update. Here, I'm just basically they're spending the same amount each year over the course of their retirement. Again, another assumption, which is an enormous one because expenditure will go up and down over time, in much the same way that savings and income and expenditure will go up from time to time over the course of their working life. The only other kind of tweak I've made in relation to retirement expenditure is that at a certain age, at this point, age 80, they're reducing their retirement expenditure by about 2% each year, just because once people get to a certain age, they have less energy and inclination to go out and spend as much as they may have had when they were earlier on in their retirement. And that reduces gradually by 2%, but it is there is still a minimum cap on the amount that they spend during their retirement. So the story here is that by the time that if they accumulate just under 600,000 here, assuming all of these, making all of these assumptions, they will still have about $225,000 in investment assets when they turn 100. That's on top of the equity that they have in their home. A lot of people might be quite pleased with this, and if they have children, the children still stand to inherit quite a large amount of money. I mean, I guess it depends on context and what your thoughts are, and how much you would like your children to inherit, but they would basically be standing to inherit if you were to, both members of the couple were to pass away at the age of 100. This amount, 225,000, plus whatever proceeds from the sale of their property might be. So let's just kind of investigate how this works. So this section here, this basically shows all of the workings. So this is the age 40. They start with an opening balance, and I'm assuming that they've got an opening balance of $100,000, primarily in KiwiSaver. Some of that might be an emergency fund or funds that they've got accessible elsewhere. This can be adjusted quite easily within the spreadsheet. You can see that starting at 50,000 changes the chart and what their long-term trajectory might be. Returns, they are calculated on the basis all returns are constant throughout the course of their life cycle. Again, it's another major assumption. And it's important to note that in order to make sure that all of the figures here represent dollars, basically today's dollars, or what that spending power is, I've made these returns and pretty much all the assumptions inflation adjusted and after tax. So 2% might seem low. It's probably more like 5% once you factor in tax and once you've factored in inflation as well. So that's basically where that return figures come from. Contributions here, initially that's basically I've just assumed 6,000 initially, and that's based on, say, a household income of $100,000, making contributions of 3% of their household income, employer contributions of 3% as well, up until the year that they repay their mortgage, in which case I'm assuming that they'll have an extra $20,000 to save between then and when they retire. Also in contributions, I've also factored in KiwiSaver, based on the assumptions I've set in here, which is basically age of entitlement being 67 and the level of New Zealand super for a couple, inflation adjusted, being 32,000 per year, which is roughly what it is now. Regarding withdrawals, over the course of their working life, I'm assuming withdrawals are nothing, because whatever income that they're generating will be, with any luck, more than enough to cover the cost of their of living. It's only when they reach the retirement age, which again I've allowed as a variable here, that they actually start spending or withdrawing from their capital. And again, that's a variable, the amount that they can spend. The one-off items is something that I will just refer to very briefly next or soon. And again, it's actually something that people can put one-off items in if that's what they wanted to do. So these forecasts aren't set in stone, and one of the things that I'm at pains to do is to run through various scenarios and to make people aware of what the assumptions that they're actually making about retirement are, and what assumptions and what potential scenarios or trade-offs might be in terms of some of the decisions they might be wanting to make. So, for instance, if this current scenario assumes that when they retire, they want to spend $52,000 per year, which is $1,000 per week in their retirement. Again, I'm assuming or hoping that they've got a mortgage-free home. And then at the age of 80, that drops 2% each year with a minimum of $40,000. Now, if we take all of the other assumptions here, we can see what the impact might be if they increase their expenditure, say, by $10,000 per year to $62,000. And that means that the amount that they would accumulate based on this forecast might not be enough to support them through to the age of 100. What that means is that there's a few things that they might need to do. One is that they might need to invest more aggressively in order to achieve that outcome. And you can see that just 1% difference can make an enormous difference in terms of over the long term, over a period of from age 40 to 100 or 60 years. Another one, if we put it back to 2%, they might find that instead of contributing 6% to KiwiSaver, they might increase their contributions from 3 to 4% and make whatever sacrifices are necessary to enable that to happen. And we can see that that does stretch out. I mean, an extra year or two, which isn't nothing. That's for sure. Another thing that they might want to do, and I'll just put this back, is they might realise that the house that's suitable for them when they're 40, which might be when they've got young kids and they need to accommodate more than 2 heads, might no longer be suitable for them when they hit their 70s, for instance, and at that point they might want to downsize or right-size their property and free up some additional capital. So I do tend to add that as a variable as well. So, for example, let's assume that the age is 70 when they want to downsize or right-size, and again, might make an assumption that they want to free up, say, $200,000 of capital. And what we can see there is that actually then frees up a fair amount in order to support a higher quality of life over their retirement. One thing I sometimes include for younger clients who might be looking at the prospect of upgrading or upsizing their property is sometimes I build that into this model. Now, like I've mentioned previously, this relates to the size of your investment portfolio. It doesn't include the equity in your home. However, if you need to borrow or use some of your investments to purchase a bigger house, the direct outcome of that is that it will mean that you'll have less to invest over the course of your life. So let's say this couple decided to spend an additional $200,000 on their home. That has a really substantial impact and enables them to be mindful of the trade-offs that they'll be making by doing so, say, at the age of 45 or in 5 years' time. I guess the corollary of that, spending an extra $200,000 on a home, is that they might be able to free up an additional either $300,000 or perhaps all of it, $400,000, when they decide to right-size. And again, maybe to enable that, they might come to terms with the fact that they might want to right-size just a bit sooner. So it's a really good way of kind of looking at the trade-offs that might be necessary to make in order to achieve or sustain the sort of lifestyle that you want. Or again, they might decide that to enable that, you might be prepared to accept a slightly lower cost of living or quality of life in retirement. Might decide to retire 5 years later, and you can see that all of these decisions can have substantial impacts on where you're going. And of course, all of these decisions, it's not just either or, but there are multiple variables you can adjust to see all of the different scenarios that play out. So, I mean, we can simplify things again. So, for example, age of retirement at 65. And again, this is an enormous assumption. I'm assuming that you're retiring cold turkey and there's no kind of gradual period of perhaps working for a period of time at lower income. It's a flawcast. It gives insight, but it won't necessarily tell the direct truth. In the same way that any retirement calculator that you use online won't be able to give you that fidelity. And I'd argue that this at least gives you more insight into the trade-offs and decisions you make than just a lot of the online calculators where you plug in a very narrow range of variables. So I'm going to remove upsizing property and perhaps maybe downsizing or right-sizing at the age of, say, 75. And I mean, that looks fairly healthy for a lot of people. Again, depending on the assumptions that they're prepared to make. Maybe you might think that you want to take on a bit more risk to try and get 1 additional percent or save fees to help enable that. And you can also see that investing conservatively over the long run actually is a risk in itself, because you can end up in a worse position than you otherwise would end up. Another one is you can explore what your feelings or thoughts are about New Zealand superannuation, whether you will be entitled to it and what level of entitlement. So maybe someone aged 40 might think or believe that you might not get it until age 70, which does have quite a significant impact. You may even think that you won't be entitled to New Zealand super, and hold your breath with this one. That has enormous impact on outcomes, and I would expect, unless things suddenly change a lot, that at the very minimum, at some point down here, you would start receiving New Zealand super. And I think the other thing I would add is going through this exercise in some ways has made me a little bit more sanguine about younger people being entitled to New Zealand super down the track, primarily on the basis that to tell someone, say, aged 40 and above, that they're going to have to save substantially more for their retirement than because New Zealand super is no longer going to be available, is a really challenging thing to tell someone at that point of life, where people often have children, they've made career commitments that are very hard to... It's very difficult to do a U-turn career-wise to generate substantially more income and therefore enable yourself to save more. So it seems like an unlikely scenario when I look at it from that perspective, but who knows? And that's something that you might need to factor in. And it might even be that maybe you might think that you'll get 2/3 of what New Zealand super is, and who knows whether that's a more or less accurate assessment of what the future might bring. As I stress, a lot of times, ultimately, your savings rate or your contributions and savings will have a really significant difference impact. So again, if you change it just 1 extra percent, that makes a difference. But if you do decide to save a little bit more, whether that's by increasing your KiwiSaver contributions to 8% with 3% employee contributions, or saving in some way outside of KiwiSaver without the restrictions, that can put you in a more comfortable financial position. And of course, the sooner you pay your mortgage back and therefore free up disposable income, the better it will be for you. Even an extra year or two really makes an enormous difference. And again, working an extra year or retiring 5 years earlier really does have a big impact, unless you're prepared to make sacrifices in terms of, say, how much you're prepared to spend in retirement. So I hope that's useful. I certainly find that with clients, when I have these discussions, they do find it extremely valuable. I can't stress enough that it's a flawcast, that it's predicated on a very limited ranges of assumptions, even if it is a slightly wider range of assumptions than most retirement calculators are. I mean, I hope I'm really transparent about that. And there are certainly things that we can't know about the future. I mean, even trying to think about what the world is going to look like between the age of 40 and the age of 100 is enormously difficult. I mean, that's like trying to predict what the world looks like today if you were in 1958. There are lots of other things. I mean, we can't tell what your health or your longevity will be. I mean, this chart, in some ways, you could argue it is biased itself by going through to age 100. Some people, you might want to go shorter. Some, it might be necessary to go longer. And health obviously has an impact. There might be additional costs in a given year with health, but you also don't know what the impact that will have in terms of longevity. Also doesn't factor in windfalls, whether that be inheritances or anything of that nature. And who knows what the twists and turns of your careers might be in terms of perhaps enabling you to save more, or maybe having periods where you're unable to work, or you're out of the workforce, or trying something that's not quite as lucrative financially. We don't know, but despite the fact that the world is uncertain, that doesn't stop us from at least planning or being prepared for it. And I think going through this exercise and at least kind of scrutinizing and getting a feel of what all of these assumptions are, what impact they might have in terms of the decisions you have. It's a really valuable process and can be quite cheering for a lot of people in terms of realizing, you know what, maybe we don't need to save as much as we initially thought, or maybe we are on track, and perhaps we've got options ahead of us in terms of potentially retiring earlier, or cutting down, or perhaps even spending more, because we're definitely on trajectory in order to save. It's also a valuable exercise for people perhaps thinking of acting as the bank of mum and dad, helping out kids with purchasing homes and financing education and things, in terms of working out what the long-term impact will be. And again, that's not to say that you shouldn't do it, but it's really helpful to be able to model and see what the applications will be.
I genuinely hope that video was useful. If you've got any suggestions, feedback, thoughts, or questions, feel free to email me. And if you've watched this video, or come across this video, you've probably gathered that I operate, or I run the New Zealand Wealth and Risk blog. Check it out. And I also operate Fairhaven Wealth, which is fiercely independent financial advice business, fixed fee advice only. I only work with clients who are engaged with their finances. So feel free to check that out as well. And feel free to sign up to my mailing list. You'll receive a number of goodies, including a free copy of, ebook copy of my book, Wealth, Simple Tips for Savvy Kiwis. Thanks. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope it was valuable.